Afternoon, everybody. I hope you're in the right session. This is Practical Strategies for Reducing the Harm of Internalized Stigma. I think we all know what shame and stigma is, but I think our workshop leader today is Alicia Lucksted, and she'll enlighten us, I'm sure, because she's got great experience. She's a clinical community psychologist at the University of Maryland Med School and one other position, and I'll turn it over to her.
Hi, everybody. I hope the conference is going really well. And, it'd be great when we can be together in person, but thanks for joining this way until we can. And at least everybody can be in the comfort of their own home. Thanks, Stuart. So I'm Alicia Lucksted. I'm a longtime member of NAMI in a number of different ways over the decades, and I'm in Baltimore City. I work at the University of Maryland, as Stuart said, and also at the Baltimore VA Medical Center. For a number of years, I've been doing resource development and research with regard to internalized stigma. And so I just had offered to the conference that maybe I could distill some of the practical strategies, and they might be of use to augment the things that people who attend the conference are already doing in your personal lives, in your advocacy and activism, in your professional lives. So, the one thing I don't know, Stuart, and you might be able to help me, is if the slides are showing and how those get advanced.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you have to share your screen.
Oh, I'm supposed to do that. Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, great. I can certainly do that. Just have to find the button. Sorry, everybody, we didn't quite get that detail down before we were.
You're good now.
Yep. I just want to make it bigger for people. Oops, or not. There we go. Okay, so hopefully you are seeing the slide, the title slide at this point. Okay, so just in terms of formalities, just so you know, I don't have any conflicts of interest. And of course, being both a state and a federal government employee, I need to say this is all my own work and my own opinions and not that of either government entity. We have a brief session today, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on background, but you can see up here what I propose to do. I wasn't sure how this conference was going to go, and so we don't really have the opportunity, it seems, to use the chat for back and forth, but I will propose some rhetorical questions, and you can answer them in your own minds as you are listening as we go along.
Alicia?
Yeah.
I just wanted to note that we do have a chat function that the technology person is monitoring. So I will take questions if they come in. And if you wrap up your program, maybe with 10 or 15 minutes to go, then I will ask you the questions that come in through the chat.
And can the participants see each other's questions and comments in it?
I believe they can.
Great, because that was the thing I thought we might use it to share some ideas, but as well as questions.
Excuse me, Alicia, they can't see it in Zoom, but they can see it on the social wall, okay, as they come in.
Okay, so just to kind of get everybody's minds in the room, it's always good to make sure that we're kind of on the same page, since these are words that I'll be using. So first of all, I know that, of course, a NAMI audience, we know what stigma is, for sure. I just want to give you a little bit of a personal soapbox, which is that even though it's a mouthful, I tend to use the word stigmatization when I can, because it focuses on us on the fact that this is a social process that we do to each other, that people do to each other. It's not something that someone has, like the chicken pox. And I just really think that's good to keep front and center, because since it's a social process, that means we all have a role in changing that process. So it's also helpful to take stigma apart into different pieces to make it more handleable when we're trying to figure out ways to reduce it and to give it less power and to erode it. And so there's actually lots of ways you can do that are quite useful. In a brief session like this, I'm not going to go into all of that, but I just wanted to say that I'll use this term public stigma or social stigma to mean kind of the messages that are out there in society that come to us through, through media, through interpersonal interactions, through all sorts of things, the kind of broad picture that we talk about. And then I'll also be talking about family stigmatization, which is, the negative assumptions and attributions and stereotypes that family members of people with mental illnesses commonly face because of the connection, the sort of stereotype connection, the misinformation that is floating out there, and the judgments against family members. And lastly, I think, and in the title of this session, internalized stigma is the thing we're going to focus on. That is when a person absorbs public stigma, which can include family stigmatization. When a person absorbs these messages into their own thinking about themselves and comes to believe, or at least kind of like accept, that these messages are actually true. So it ends up being a self-judgment that's from absorbing the things that culture is telling us. If anybody hears the term courtesy stigma, I really hate that, and we can talk about that in the question and answer. That is something that gets levied about families that I can't stand. Anyway, I'll be using these terms. Internalized stigma, where it gets into your thinking, is often called self-stigma as well. All right, so I know at this audience, I don't have to talk about how terrible public stigma is and how it really drags people down. It blocks off opportunities. It makes people feel dreadful, angry, alienated, all sorts of things. I want to just reinforce that when we absorb these messages into our own thinking, that adds another layer of weight of bad emotions, actions, thinking about yourself. So it adds a whole nother burden on top of just the things that societal stigma causes. And I'm sure that most of these are familiar, that internalizing stereotypes about mental illness can make people feel dreadful about themselves, can make them feel ashamed, can make them feel very alienated, angry, or demoralized. And that a lot of times that translates into action, that that leads us to avoid things, to isolate ourselves, the sort of like, why even try? Because everybody's going to think that I'm dreadful in this, that, or the other way anyway. And that, of course, impedes our ability to join with things that could be helpful to us. So again, this is just really brief to kind of get everybody's mind in the room, so to speak, since I know that stigma is a really central thing that NAMI struggles with. So the real question is, how can we help ourselves and each other to minimize the harm that internalized stigma causes? My idea is that we're all trying to clean up these messages. We're all trying to clean up the sources of public stigma, but that is a really long-term goal. And there's been lots of advances made. I mean, we've really made progress over the decades, but it's still really a big problem. So until we can create a non-stigmatizing society, how can we reduce the harm that it causes us? We have to navigate the current reality while we try to improve it. And so I tried to boil down the things that that I've been working on into, I think I said 5 strategies. You can kind of, cut and slice and dice them different ways. And so I think I did 5, yeah. That I think will sound familiar to you in some ways, but hopefully can give you a few new ideas as well. And in some cases, even if it's familiar, it's doing these things deliberately, that really consciously, that can really help us erode the power of internalized stigma. And the first one is naming it and recognizing it as a danger. Societal stigmatization and internalized stigma is not just unfair, it's not just unnice, it is actually dangerous. It is a big hazard for us. And naming it is really important because you can't grapple with something that you don't know exists. So we name it so we can talk about it, so we can grab onto it and wrestle with it. So I often use a pollution analogy that like air pollution, stigma is hard to avoid, and taking it into yourself, like air pollution getting into your lungs, is not your fault. But at the same time, you're left dealing with the damaging consequences. So like little triangles on the right, stigma is out there in society, and it's not our fault that we sometimes absorb some of these ideas into our own assumptions or thinking about ourselves, but we are left dealing with the damage that that causes. So naming it to ourselves, to others, helps make it something that we can recognize and watch out for and strategize. I find that a lot of people don't know this idea of internalized stigma or self-stigma. And so that's why it's strategy number one. Talking about it can demystify it, make it clear that shame and demoralization are an effect of it, not a fact related to mental illness. And so I think it's really important. And although I can't see your chat, since it does go on the social wall, if you have examples of how you are doing this, naming and recognizing internalized stigma as a danger, feel free to put it on the social wall because it might help somebody else get a new idea. And that would be really great. Okay. Number two. Sorry, I'm just looking at the time. Number two is that there are various things we can do to reduce the power of stigmatizing messages so that they are less likely to get into our thinking about ourselves. So even though we maybe can't clean them up from all of society, we can protect ourselves a little bit, make them weaker in terms of getting into our own thinking. So I'll quickly mention these 5 ways that you can reduce the power of stigmatizing messages to reduce internalization. The first one is that if you can, and I think this is probably something very common to everyone, when we can, reducing our exposure to stigmatizing sources when we can. The principle here is that being exposed to negative messages repeatedly, frequently, the more often you're exposed to them, the harder it is to keep them out of your thinking. It can become where it seems like normative, like people say something enough and sometimes people can start to think that things are actually true. So this might be just refusing to get drawn into a certain fruitless conversation, or more overtly saying, you know, I really can't be around you when you talk that way about people I love. I mean, we all can do different things and it is limited. Sometimes we have to put up with certain stigmatizing sources of stigma, but to the extent you can reduce your exposure to stigmatizing sources, that can reduce the risk of internalization. The other thing is that we can often do is create emotional distance from that. So the principle behind this is that when people or institutions that we are close to and that we revere or that we really respect or that we depend on, when they are sending stigmatizing messages, it's harder to not let those into our thinking. And you can see why, because these are people we revere or respect or are dependent on and are close to. But even so, we can create an emotional distance. We can see these people with compassion, or these institutions with compassion as flawed. They are not evil, they are not something we have to like toss away, but we can see them as flawed, and the messages that they're giving us are incorrect in this regard. And so we can create that emotional distance. You know, so this might be a pastor or a doctor or a relative, for example. Years ago, I had cancer and I asked my oncologist about medical crisis counseling because, of course, I needed some support. And she actually said, oh, we don't usually suggest that because we don't want people to think that there's something wrong with them. And I said, well, I have a potentially fatal illness. There is something wrong with me. And, you know, I need support. But my point is I stayed with her because she was very technically good for the type of cancer I had. But I got my emotional support from other places. So that's what I mean. We don't have to necessarily just reject these things if we need them for other reasons, these people or institutions, but we can create emotional distance. The third, which backs up the other two, is a NAMI truism. This goes through every NAMI program that's ever existed, is to know myths from facts. You know, knowing what is true for you, for your illness, for your family, helps you recognize stigmatizing messages and misinformation and to discount them. So being solid in your knowledge of the facts and figures of what works for you and what doesn't, to have that confidence can really help you be able to, again, discount when someone says, oh, for sure, you should, do XYZ. That is completely not what's going to help you. And lastly, this is kind of related to D. We can reduce the power of stigmatizing messages to get in our thinking when we take agency in what we think and say. You can't be conscious every moment of every day of, analyzing everything. That just doesn't work. But sometimes we can go the other direction a bit too much. If we're just kind of passively going along because things are busy or we've got a lot to think about, we can just kind of start absorbing things from the people and the institutions around us that we end up thinking without really examining. So being consciously aware of what is my viewpoint, what are my values, what is my bias in this situation or that situation. We can be more deliberate in how we react to things and what information we decide to take in and make part of our thinking, and what information we, say, well, I'm going to hold my judgment on that one, or no, that is not what I want to be part of. So by taking agency in what we think and say, we can also kind of have a stronger center. So when stigmatizing messages come at us, we're more able to accept things into our thinking or not. So again, with these 4, I invite you to put ideas that you have that might help somebody else, put these into action in the chat. In such a short session, I'd like to have a whole discussion and talk about like real stories and stuff. And it's just really short. So I thought at least that way people can cross-pollinate each other's good ideas.
Alicia?
Yeah.
So there is a question just throw out before you launch into strategy 3.
I know. Launch is a good word.
My loved one has shared about how mental illnesses are talked about contributes to a person taking on the role of a victim rather than taking responsibility and working on recovery, and that you carry the diagnostic label forever. What is your thinking on that?
I'm not sure I totally understand. So many mental illness experiences are dreadful. And they disrupt people's lives. There's suffering. It's not like a person is, should just sort of like, lace up their boots and get back to recovery. Things are really disruptive and horrible at times. And so we need to acknowledge that as well. It's hard for me so I'm not sure. Could you say that again, please?
Sure. My loved one has shared that how mental illnesses are talked about contributes to a person taking on the role of a victim rather than taking responsibility and working on recovery, and that you carry that diagnostic label forever. What is your thinking about that?
Thank you for repeating that. It's hard when I can't see it. So
sure.
two additional thoughts. I would say the person is entirely right. How mental illness is talked about sends messages. And whether you carry a diagnostic label for the rest of your life, I think that depends and is somewhat within one's own, power, if you carry it or you don't. To say that I had, a major depressive episode or that I struggle with bipolar disorder or OCD, people frame their stories in various different ways. And actually, that is another part of one of the strategies. But the person's certainly right that how we talk about things does set the table for, what those stories are like. So if we talk about people having, a sentence of schizophrenia, and we talk about it as a hopeless thing that has derailed their life forever, rather than a serious and sometimes horrible, challenge and illness, that gives some opportunity that there's going to be a brighter future. I think that they're right, that how we talk about these things does indeed set the tone for the future messages.
Alicia, I had one comment in that I have bipolar disorder, been working with it for 30 years. I often say I have bipolar disorder if I'm having a discussion about it. I don't say I'm bipolar. That's
yes, there's that, of course, as well. Person first language and not letting yourself be defined by something, for sure.
Yeah.
And actually, we'll get to that one too.
Great.
So I'm going to go on. And as I said, I know that just as Stuart said, I am packaging strategies that at least parts of are already familiar to many of the people attending this conference. And my purpose in doing that is to point out that we have these tools already, but sometimes using them consciously is what makes them more powerful. And that's true of this one as well. Active counter messaging. What I mean by that, it is not enough to just know that a given message is malarkey. It's not enough to just know that talking about oneself as a schizophrenic or as bipolar is not a great way of framing one's illness in the context of one's life. It's not enough to know that some other stereotype is a stereotype. If you really want to undermine its danger for internalization, you have to actively activate, rehearse, deliberately expose yourself to more helpful and accurate counter messages. So the point is not just knowing it, but activating it and actively kind of rehearsing it, putting yourself in the way of these counter messages. So a person I know has a certain thing that she wants to remind herself of all the time, and she didn't want to write it out because she felt that that would be stigmatizing if someone caught, caught sight of a sticky note on her planner or something. So she has a pink bookmark, and that reminds her of her counter message all the time. My point is that even we're not talking, we can be talking about yelling things from the top of mountains, but it also can be in more subtle ways, in any way that works for you. To use phrases and people and stories that elevate success and elevate hope, and also put things into a realistic framework as opposed to these overly dramatized and false stereotypes. So this, can also be involve questioning stigma when you hear it. Again, you're deliberately interrupting it and then replacing it with something more accurate, like, no, that's not actually true. Not all people who've been hospitalized can never be trusted to drive a car. You're like, that's just not true. You might not choose to be that upfront, but other people would. The whole point is that deliberately activating and rehearsing more accurate and helpful messages that counteract stigmatizing ones is a way not only to do good in the world, but to help our own thinking not absorb these things. It could be recovery videos. It could be helping someone else think through, what exactly do you want to think about that? Is that really true? And to question what these stereotypes are actually saying to us, whether it's word choice or some more broad pronouncement about people's futures. And there too, you might put some of these ideas you have in the chat or the social wall that might help somebody else come up with a new idea. The overall point is that saying something, doing something, or exposing yourself to an active counter message acts as an antidote to the stigmatization seeping into our own thinking. What I said earlier, you get exposed to things all the time, and it can be really sneaky. And by doing this, it kind of helps to counteract that. It serves as an antidote.
Alicia?
Yeah.
I have one to say. Sometimes when someone makes a disparaging comment about someone who has a mental illness episode, I say, why would you say that? What makes you think that?
So you're questioning.
Yeah.
That is a way of interrupting it, for sure.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And, in this presentation, I'm focusing on how we protect ourselves from internalizing these messages. And certainly questioning them is a good example of that. And sometimes you have to, there's many things that we do to try to interrupt stigma and prejudice, in our social environments, large and small. And in this presentation, I was focusing on a bit of self-care, that these things can seep into our own thinking, sometimes without our even knowing it. Questioning the things around you is certainly another way. Combining these first three can be particularly powerful in avoiding accepting stigmatizing messages as true of ourselves. So this is an example, just one of many, of what some people might know, if you're at all familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy, as the 3 C's: catch it, check it, change it. that when someone catches themselves thinking thoughts about oneself that make you feel bad, you pause and you think, why am I thinking that? Why am I feeling ashamed of going to therapy? Like, what is behind that? That is a clue that maybe one of these stigmatizing messages has seeped into our thinking, much like air pollution can seep into our lungs. But we can catch it and we can think, why do I feel ashamed to go to therapy? And really think about that. And then often what helps is to think, what's the thought, the automatic thought, the reflex thought that leads to this feeling? In this person's case, it was an idea that all I am is a mental patient and nothing's ever going to go anywhere. And so that was what they could catch by tracing back, noticing the feeling and tracing back what the thought was. And then the next step is that you can check it. The criteria are, is it true and is it helpful? And the person, sort of like you were saying, Stuart, says, no, this makes me feel bad and it's not true. So that is not helpful. It is not a useful thought. And you can see how this combines elements of the first three that I was talking about. So then we can do that agency, like I said, and change it, like deliberately rehearse something that is more helpful and more accurate. Like, I'm a lot more than my diagnosis, and I know from the past that therapy helps me reach my goals. And often people find that this leads to a different feeling. And this is related to the basic cognitive therapy principles that what we think affects how we feel, affects how we behave, and the triangle of the three can all influence each other. So when I deliberately turn my thinking to something that's more balanced, more accurate, and more helpful to myself, that will often shift my feeling about what I'm doing and honestly make people more likely to actually show up to therapy as opposed to going home and turning on the TV or going back to bed. So this is a really good example of shifting perspective. Can we literally decide that we're going to look at something in a different way? And it relates to something else that you said earlier, Stuart, that, many of us have really poignant stories of illness and management efforts and challenges and obstacles and overcoming them or being rolled over by them and eventually getting back up and trying again. I mean, we have some real stories of ups and downs. And do we tell ourselves and others a story of being battered by fate and misfortune and being helpless on a sea of, obstacles and challenge? I mean, it's possible. It's reasonable to do that. Some things that happen to people are that terrible. You can't blame anybody for that. But with perspective, we can sometimes also frame our story instead as one of resourcefulness, of endurance, focus on the getting up again, and how persistent a person is on, what could be a very difficult road. So that shift in perspective can then make us feel differently about our own autobiographies, about our own path. And that changes feelings, changes thinking, and can change people's behaviors. So to actually question and replace stigma messages when they play back in our heads is an important strategy that kind of puts the first three together. And again, if there are ways that you have found that are helpful for doing that, feel free to share them with each other. The fifth one, yes, let me go to the screen. Okay, we're doing good. I was looking at the time. The fifth one is quite different, but does relate to something that you said a couple minutes ago, Stuart, which is to not let our identity get eclipsed or engulfed, overwhelmed by stigma, to not let stigmatizing messages, to not let diagnostic labels, to not let certain parts of our story and our lives define us, and to avoid being limited by the illness, the hard road, the diagnosis. They're, parts of our story, but they're not the whole thing. The principle behind this is that we find that people who have a varied and positive sense of self, that cultivate different aspects of themselves, like my crude flower here, that they don't have all their self-worth eggs in one basket, so to speak. And so they're more resilient when something dreadful happens. Like if you think of this person represented in this flower, like let's say that they're a tuba player in a local orchestra and that's really important to them. And then the orchestra gets defunded and they don't get to play the tuba anymore in the orchestra. If all their self-worth was wrapped up in that position, playing the tuba in that orchestra, they could really be decimated. But if they have all these different facets that are important and strong in their self-concept, they'll still be disappointed, but it won't be quite so crushing. And they're more resilient because they have other things that they get their feelings of contribution and self-worth and satisfaction from. So growing positive aspects of yourself gives you more and varied facets or petals to draw on for satisfaction, for ideas about what the future might hold, but even for coping strategies when you are facing an obstacle. The other thing it does, though, is that it gives stigma a smaller target. That, when somebody says something disrespectful or when somebody excludes you because of the gap in your resume or something like that, it hurts and it's not fair. I mean, it's not like I'm trying to say it's all fine, but it can be a little bit less crushing. It could be less likely to get internalized when you know, like, well, okay, that's terrible and unfair, and I got to decide whether I'm going to, sue them or whether I'm going to protest or whether I'm just going to go on to the next thing. But it's not quite as toxic when you have a sense of yourself that's more three-dimensional and has lots of different parts that are positive and strong. So the strategy here is to give some sunlight and some water, some space and time to parts of yourself and your life that you like and value, so that they grow and they can help you, have more enjoyment, but also be more resilient. And that is certainly part of the whole recovery sort of philosophy of mental health. It also is something broader than mental health, just this principle of being more resilient when one has a more multifaceted self-concept. So I think that's a way of taking like the buzzword of self-care into a more strategic place of trying to undermine the power that stigma can have over us. So obviously I've just sort of pulled 5 different ways of thinking about things, into a short presentation like this. And so I just wanted to finish with a couple of thoughts about putting these all together in real life. So there are many other strategies for reducing internalized stigma's harm or internalized stigma's power to get into our thinking. And maybe you've already shared some of these, or we want to chat about them in the Q&A time. Some of the other ones I haven't mentioned, for example, are cultivating a sense of belonging in many different ways that can be an antidote to the alienation that stigma can cause. As Stuart mentioned, speaking up and advocacy can be another way of disempowering, sort of taking the power away from stigmatizing messages. Being an active bystander where you're supporting somebody else or interrupting when someone says something foolish and hurtful, those also are good strategies. We also have in one of the programs that we do called Ending Self-Stigma, of saying about increase the positive, decrease the negative, and bring your best self to the difficult interaction when there are people that you have to be close to who are trying to undermine you or are stigmatizing. Like, how do you navigate that? So there's lots of things I haven't talked about today, and I'm sure you have other ones in mind. The point is that these are all woven together. They're not just like we do 1, 2, 3, like they're little beads on a string, and that some will resonate for some people and their situation, and that personalizes them is really important. So they're infinitely connectable and combinable, like all these complicated fabrics on this slide. I also wanted to mention that, of course, the struggles around stigma and mental illness, or any of the other related terms, don't happen in isolation. We all have multiple parts to ourselves, multiple identities and communities and environments that we're part of. And so some of these principles indeed come from and are relevant to things like internalized racism, internalized stigma, sexism, homophobia, and other things. And they all, weave together in somebody's life. So there's lots of different unique aspects and variations, but these strategies can be applied in various different ways, whether you're talking about mental health specifically and stigma, or we're talking about other forms of oppression and other isms. Just
Alicia?
a little more real life. Yeah.
Yes, so there's another question that came in. Would you talk more about family stigmatization in relation to your 5 strategies?
Oh, sure, that's a good one. I deliberately wanted to leave as much time as possible because, especially when we can't even see each other or chat before and afterwards, it's so hard to figure out what's really going to be useful to people. So that's great. So yeah, so if you think back, so family stigmatization is a lot of different things. And I'm sure you all could probably recite them numerous facets better than I, but just to mention a couple to define family stigma more for somebody who maybe is less, new to the group. Maybe I'll go back to that. Is that a lot of times family members of people with serious mental health problems get stigmatized themselves. And this, I don't know, happens in a whole bunch of ways. Some of the most common are families get blamed for people's stigma. I'm sorry, for people's mental illness, like because, I don't know, some stupid statement about, things about your parenting made the person more vulnerable to developing a mental illness, or that family members themselves must be mentally ill because it runs in families, or that if family members just did something, X, Y, Z, then this person who is ill would be better. There's going back even further, the certain, like the schizophrenic mother, there's all sorts of things like that. And I'm sure that I'm missing a couple that people will put in the chat, but generally this idea that if I have a mental illness that is causing disruption in my life and causing me struggles, that family members around me are somehow going to be tainted with the same stigma or with a related stigma. That's what I mean. Unfortunately, family members can sometimes absorb that into their own thinking. It's so hard to sometimes navigate the complexity and the pain of what happens when someone is seriously ill, that I've so often heard family members blaming themselves and saying, well, if I had just done this, if I had just done that, or trying to control everything, when of course everything is not controllable. And might be nicer to think that if we could just do it right, that things would be better than it is to realize that things are out of our control. So family members can absorb that stigma, and that does dreadful, corrosive things. It becomes internalized into their own self-concept sometimes, so they're blaming themselves or feeling dreadful and hopeless themselves. It can cause additional distress for them, and it can cause them to then lash out or be all different negative ways towards others, whether it's rejecting help that's offered or never thinking that mental illness has to be kept a secret. There's all sorts of ways that it can lead to negative outcomes. So that's what I meant. In terms of the strategies, they really apply. I mean, I meant to be talking about them, I meant all these strategies to be including family stigma every step of the way. So all of that applies. And
Alicia?
Yes.
Yeah, so one of the things I've noticed too is both substance abuse and mental illness a lot of times go together. They're both highly stigmatized. So yeah. I see that so repeatedly in folks trying to cope with either one of those or both. It's pretty challenging.
For sure. Both are very stigmatized, as are a whole bunch of other things in people's lives. So these principles and strategies can apply to a number of different things. There are also differences. So it's not like every kind of stigma is exactly the same, but you're right, of course, it can very much apply.
There's another question. Any books you would recommend to learn more about this topic?
I can't think of any off the top of my head. but I imagine that other people listening who are not in the middle of thinking about a presentation and can bring those books more readily to mind probably can put them on the social wall to help you out.
Yeah, no worries. That makes sense.
Yeah. So I do want to just finish what I was going to say about family stigmatization, because it seems from that question that perhaps I wasn't clear that all the time that I was talking about internalization, I'm talking about family stigma being internalized into family members thinking about themselves, as much as I'm talking about the stigmatization of mental illnesses or mental health treatment being internalized into the thinking of individuals who are using those services or experiencing those illnesses. So all of these apply, and naming family stigma as a thing and how it's dangerous because it gets internalized into our thinking as family members, is as much part of strategy number one as anything else, and similar with the other 4 strategies. So are there other questions or comments, Stuart, that we should have some time on?
I can throw one out there. I think cleaning up the messages of public stigma, I like that phrase that you used, because I think that's hard to do in the face of, whether it's media or different types of, neighbors or whatever. That, I think that's one of the more challenging things.
Yes, for sure. It surely is. I realize if I stop sharing, I can see the chat as well. Right. So people contribute in ways large and small to that difficult task that you were saying about cleaning up the social environment. NAMI, of course, is a center for that, whether it's by supporting each other in a family support group, or whether it is, advocating publicly for better services or better regulations, or even more so directly in things like stigma busters and related things where we're actively, directly tackling stigmatizing messages in media or in other places through NAMI's own channels. All of those are, of course, ways that contribute. And yes, it is a long road, but there have been a lot of improvements over the decades. And I think that people doing those small things with persistence is what has really made that difference. So it's for sure worthwhile, even though, yes, it's a long road. Yeah. So I was just looking at the things that Judy, thank you, you have been relaying into our chat here. So I wonder, since I had left, I wanted to leave ample time for discussion. I wonder if those who are watching the live streaming have thoughts or comments about applying these 5 strategies in real life, or examples of situations where you might want to do that, particularly around internalized stigma, but of course it's all related. And so I just wanted to take our conversation in the direction that you would find useful.
There was a question about just generally, would education and poverty be forms of family stigma?
Would
or maybe
education, not quite sure I understand that. Would education be a form of family stigma? Would poverty be a form of family stigma? Not directly necessarily, but they could be, they certainly could be related. I don't think I understand that.
I think that might be getting at if you have a lack of education or economically you're not doing very well, that might be a stigma that the family carries in the same way that a family with a mental health, a family member with a mental health condition, they might also have a similar type of stigma. You said that there's a lot of different types of stigmas.
Yeah, so if that's what the person meant, then for sure. I mean, being poor in this country is stigmatized far beyond just being of limited economic means. All sorts of moral and moral and social judgments are assumed about people who are economically poor, and all sorts of outcomes and motivations and likelihoods are assumed about them. Just, this similar dynamics of stereotyping any group that, again, we are looking down upon. We do this to each other. So yes, and that can of course get in one's thinking there too, and can be just as corrosive and dangerous. And when these things are piled on top of each other, even more dangerous. I wonder if that's what the person actually meant, and if Stuart and I have mangled your question, please correct us. I think the question relates to discrimination that's intersectional and is an added bias or assumptions about individuals' mental health challenges. Oh yes, of course. As I said at the end, I'm trying to distill out some practical strategies, and to do that, I have to kind of take them out of that whole fabric of one's of complicated life. But it is very intersectional. Now, the prejudice and discrimination that one faces because of, say, homophobia, and the prejudice and discrimination that one faces because of, say, having had a difficult course with a mental illness, and the prejudice and discrimination one faces, let's say, with poverty, they have some common elements. And that's why I think some of these strategies can be useful in a variety of different stigmatized identities. But they also have some really unique dynamics and details. And so I'd never say that they're exactly the same at all, but they do have some common elements. And I've learned a lot from looking at, how to erode prejudice and internalized stigma in a variety of different identities and situations and conditions that society tends to look down upon.
There's another question. Do you see that?
Yeah. How do you break the internal stigma where family stigma prevents me from sharing my mental health issues? So yeah, I mean, how you take these ideas and apply them to your own individual life is, of course, more complicated than some 50-minute presentation. And, I wouldn't claim to be able to say, oh yes, these will all just work for you fabulously. But that is what part of the problem, that sometimes family members feeling ashamed, feeling like mental illness is something that has to be hidden, feeling that it's a secret, that can really make it difficult for a person who wants to be more open and more matter-of-fact about what's going on and doesn't think of it as some sort of shameful secret. I think, not knowing the person who wrote that, who asked that personal situation, I can't say so much, but do keep in mind that internalized stigma is something in your own mind. And while you are not to blame for it being there, like air pollution in your lungs, you do have power to undermine it. And that's really what I was trying to offer in these 5 strategies. That if you notice, all of these strategies are things that you can do without anybody else's permission, because they have to do with how, an individual person is thinking about it. Now, they can have social aspects too, but even naming it for yourself as, okay, I have been in this environment and this is how my family is, and it's really hard on me and it's getting into my thinking so that I feel ashamed as well, or whatever the reality is. Even just being aware that that's happening makes it less powerful, because then you have something to hold on to and you can decide, do I want to accept that message into my own thinking? And sure, it's a challenge. I'm not saying it's easy, but I think it's really important to realize that we can have a say in what we choose to think and what ideas we choose to reject, even when maybe we can't say it out loud, or even if we decide it is not going to be a fruitful conversation to oppose that idea vocally. You still can have that power yourself, and that can help to dislodge the internalized part, even if, say, a family's attitudes or the stigma in a family prevents you from doing that more openly. And of course, if I've totally mangled what that situation is, I'm really sorry. What about the stigma of past incarceration? What strategy can be used to help someone? Well, there too, we're talking about 2 things, right? We're talking about public stigma, that having a criminal record in many places can be, held against somebody, can be, the person can be assumed to be things that they're not, and that internalizing those social judgments can be really corrosive to the person's own self-concept and their sort of persistence in making their life the way they want to. So I do think that the internalized parts of that might be amenable to these strategies, and they certainly wouldn't be hurt by it. The societal judgments about people who've been incarcerated or returning citizens, that is another thing, like the societal stigma of stigmatization of mental illness that we all have to work against. So that is two things. One is we need to be opposing that, undermining it publicly. And the other is that if you're in that situation, to not believe the hype, to not let it into your thinking and try to resist, and instead think of the multifaceted positive parts of one's life so that you can draw on those strengths to make the future more like you want it to be. I'm not saying it, trying to be Pollyanna, but that it will be more possible if you can take that personal power in hand to help yourself. Do you think that art, including the performing arts, can counteract public stigma? I think that's kind of a tautology. Yes, of course. We see that all the time. We have, numerous plays and online performances and films that send powerful messages. And certainly there have been ones that send powerfully stigmatizing messages. But we also, there are many that send powerful recovery promoting messages and balanced viewpoints of people who have serious mental health problems portrayed as real life three-dimensional people who have a lot to offer in the future in society. I know that NAMI has been part of a number of those. There's also, if you even just Google recovery videos, there's lots of different sources of specific things, specific videos about people navigating the difficulties of mental health in their lives in a more powerful way. So of course, yes, I think so.
So we have about 5 minutes left. So if there are other questions, it'd be great to get them into the chat, and we'll try to get Alicia's take on them. I had one comment I thought about. I was on a panel a couple of years ago, and a woman who had a mental illness, she started the talk by saying, she just started and she said, funny farm, cracked, psycho, crazy, mental. She just named 20 words that are stigmatizing. And it was a very powerful presentation.
Right. So, I mean, that I think for most people, that is probably old hat, that we want to avoid such terms and, promote more accurate, again, going back to that kind of how to assess the thought, going at more accurate and useful ways of of describing people's situations or whatever, including person-first language, as you gave an example of that earlier, Stuart, that we talk about someone, a person who has been hospitalized for a mental health crisis, as opposed to, I don't know, a lunatic in the bin or something horrible like that, that we want to put the first person first as a way of just showing that we don't agree with those. We don't condone, that's the word I'm looking for. We don't condone the way that affects people's thinking about each other, that we're trying to interrupt that. So for sure, language is a very powerful way of doing that more broadly. I proposed this session because I have found over the years, as I have been, whether it's part of NAMI programs or in my professional work or the clinical classes that we offer sort of thing, that a lot of times people don't know about internalized stigma and its dangers. Once they kind of have the word, they're like, well, yeah, obviously it happens, but that it's not something we talk about quite so much as like societal stigma. And in a way, of course, that makes sense, because the public stigma that's out there is huge and it comes from all different places. And I mean, it's much bigger than any one of us, of course. I took this niche of addressing internalized stigma because that is something that we have to navigate to stay well, to stay functioning, to stay in the fight, that we have to navigate. It is a persistent danger, like air pollution. We're being exposed to it frequently. It's persistently trying to kind of get into our thinking and undermine our ability to make our lives the way more like we want them to be and to improve society. So I thought it was a real problem that it's not a recognized danger. And maybe in a NAMI conference, more people are like, what are you talking about? Of course we know what internalized stigma is. But I propose this because I have found that it's not always the case. So if this whole session was old hat to you, then please pass it on to someone for whom it's not, because we find in a lot of places that people are not aware of how dangerous this is. And it's undermining their ability to cope, to navigate the different challenges that they face. And so you could add this to another part of your toolbox when you are just going about your daily life, whether you're an activist or an actuary, whatever you're doing, to help people undermine the power that stigma can have in dragging down their lives.
Alicia, I just want to thank you very much. I thought it was a brilliant presentation. You brought a lot of great thoughts to all of us. And I think you're right on in terms of not everybody thinks about that as much.
Well, thanks for your kind words. I hope that it's useful to folks. I'll look for more comments on the social wall if we can. And have a great rest of the conference, everybody. I'm looking forward to it.